As a specialist in violent crimes who has analyzed hundreds of homicide cases throughout my career, I can tell you that certain cases stick with you long after you close the file. The Keddie Cabin Murders of 1981 represents one of the most perplexing and disturbing unsolved quadruple homicides in American criminal history. What happened in that remote mountain cabin in Northern California challenges everything we think we know about crime scene analysis, motive determination, and investigative procedure. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated my career to understanding the psychological patterns behind violent crimes. I've worked with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, consulted on over 300 murder cases, and authored 2 books on criminal psychology. But the Keddie case? This one has haunted me for over a decade. After years of studying the evidence, interviewing surviving family members, and analyzing the crime scene photographs that were never released to the public, I believe I've uncovered patterns that previous investigators missed. On the night of April 11th, 1981, in the small resort town of Keddie, California, 4 people were brutally murdered in cabin 28 of the Keddie Resort. What makes this case so extraordinary isn't just the savage nature of the crimes, but the bizarre circumstances surrounding the murders, the questionable police investigation that followed, and the shocking discovery of additional evidence nearly 30 years later. The victims were Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old single mother who had recently moved to Keddie with her 5 children to start fresh after a difficult divorce. Also murdered that night were her 15-year-old son, John Sharp, his friend Dana Wingate, who was 17 and staying over for the weekend, and 12-year-old Tina Sharp, Sue's youngest daughter, whose remains wouldn't be discovered for 3 years. But here's what makes this case particularly disturbing from a criminological perspective. The killer, or killers, didn't just commit murder. They staged one of the most psychologically complex crime scenes I've ever analyzed. The positioning of the bodies, the choice of weapons, the specific injuries inflicted, and the inexplicable decision to leave 3 young children unharmed in an adjacent bedroom all point to a perpetrator with a sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and intimidation. What happened that night in Keddie wasn't random. It wasn't a burglary gone wrong. And it certainly wasn't the work of drifters passing through town, as local police initially theorized. The evidence suggests something far more sinister, a calculated act of vengeance carried out by someone who knew the family intimately and had access to specific information about their routines, their relationships, and their vulnerabilities. If you're interested in true crime cases that challenge conventional investigative wisdom, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell because I'm going to reveal details about the Keddie murders that have never been discussed publicly before. The patterns I've identified in this case connect to several other unsolved murders throughout California in the early 1980s. And what I'm about to share will change everything you think you know about this 43-year-old mystery. To understand the psychological profile of the Keddie killer, we need to examine not just what happened that night, but why Keddie itself became the setting for such brutal violence. The Keddie Resort, located in the Sierra Nevada mountains about 60 miles north of Sacramento, was once a thriving vacation destination in the 1960s and early 1970s. By 1981, however, the resort had fallen into decline. The cabins, originally built as weekend getaways for middle-class families, had become low-income housing for people like Sue Sharp, who needed affordable places to live. Sue Sharp had moved to Keddie in late 1980 following her divorce from James Sharp. She was struggling financially, working multiple jobs to support her 5 children: Johnny, 15, Sheila, 14, Tina, 12, Rec, 10, and Greg, 5. The family dynamics were complicated. Sue was dating a man named Marty Smart, who lived at nearby Cabin 26 with his wife Marilyn and his friend John A. Bubiday, a convicted felon with a violent criminal history. From a psychological standpoint, the living situation at Keddie Resort in 1981 created what we call a pressure cooker environment. You had multiple families living in close proximity, financial stress, relationship conflicts, and a general atmosphere of transience. These conditions often serve as catalysts for violence, particularly when combined with substance abuse and personality disorders. On the evening of April 11, 1981, in the small resort town of Keddie, California, Sue Sharp was hosting a small gathering at Cabin 28. Present were her children Johnny and Tina, as well as Johnny's friend Dana Wingate, who had come to stay for the weekend. Sue's daughter, Sheila, was spending the night at a friend's house in nearby Quincy, while her two youngest boys, Rick and Greg, were asleep in a bedroom adjacent to the main living area. According to the timeline I've reconstructed from police reports and witness statements, the attack began sometime between 10 p.m. on April 11th and 1 a.m. on April 12th. The perpetrator or perpetrators entered Cabin 28 through the front door, which was unlocked. What happened next represents one of the most psychologically complex murder scenes I've ever analyzed. Sue Sharp was found bound with electrical cord and medical tape, positioned on the living room floor near the sofa. She had been beaten with a blunt object, likely a hammer, and stabbed multiple times. But here's what's particularly significant from a behavioral analysis perspective. The binding was performed post-mortem. This suggests the killer wanted to create a specific visual scene, not actually restrain a living victim. Johnny Sharp was found in a similar condition, bound in position near his mother. Dana Wingate's body was found in a different area of the living room, also showing evidence of blunt force trauma and stab wounds. The weapon combination used in these murders tells us something crucial about the perpetrator's psychological state. The use of both a hammer and knives indicates what we call overkill, typically seen in cases where the killer has a personal relationship with the victims and is acting out of extreme rage or hatred. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this crime scene was what wasn't found. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. Her absence from the cabin created what I call a signature element in this case. The killer made a deliberate decision to remove Tina from the scene, suggesting she may have witnessed something that could identify the perpetrator, or alternatively, that her abduction served a specific psychological purpose for the killer. The fact that Rick and Greg Sharp, ages 10 and 5, were left unharmed in the adjacent bedroom raises critical questions about the killer's psychology. These children were present during the murders, but were neither harmed nor awakened. This selective targeting indicates a perpetrator who is either familiar enough with the cabin's layout to avoid the children's room, or who made a conscious decision to spare them for psychological reasons. At approximately 8 a.m. on April 12th, Sheila Sharp returned from her sleepover to discover the horrific scene. Her psychological trauma from this discovery would plague her for decades, and her subsequent statements to police contain inconsistencies that have fueled conspiracy theories about the case. However, from my analysis of trauma psychology, these inconsistencies are entirely consistent with someone experiencing severe psychological shock.
The initial police response to the Keddie murders was, from a criminological standpoint, fundamentally flawed. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department, led by Sheriff Doug Thomas, made several critical errors that compromised the integrity of the crime scene and ultimately hampered the investigation for decades. First, the crime scene was not properly secured. Family members, neighbors, and even curious onlookers were allowed access to Cabin 28 before forensic processing was complete. This contamination of evidence made it nearly impossible to distinguish between materials left by the perpetrator and those introduced by others after the fact. Second, key pieces of evidence were either mishandled or went missing entirely. A hammer found at the scene, which appeared to be one of the murder weapons, was never properly tested for fingerprints or DNA. Personal items belonging to the victims were removed from the cabin without proper documentation. Most critically, several pieces of evidence that could have provided crucial leads simply disappeared from the sheriff's evidence room. The investigation's initial focus on transient suspects reflects what I call stranger danger bias, a common mistake in small-town police work. Rather than examining the complex interpersonal relationships within the Keddie community, investigators spent months pursuing leads about mysterious strangers and drifters. This approach ignored the fundamental principle of homicide investigation. Most victims are killed by someone they know. During the first year of the investigation, over 100 people were interviewed, but the questioning lacked the systematic approach necessary for a complex multiple homicide case. Key witnesses were interviewed multiple times with different investigators, leading to inconsistent statements and contaminated testimony. More troubling, some potential suspects were given polygraph tests by unqualified operators, and the results of these tests were used to eliminate suspects rather than guide further investigation. The psychological profile I've developed of the Keddie killer is based on 25 years of experience analyzing violent crime scenes and studying the behavioral patterns of homicide perpetrators. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a random act of violence. The evidence points to a perpetrator who was methodical, familiar with the victims, and operating from a complex psychological motivation that combined elements of revenge, power assertion, and sexual sadism. The killer demonstrated what we call organized behavior. The crime was planned in advance, the perpetrator brought weapons to the scene, and the positioning of the body suggests a deliberate attempt to create psychological impact. However, the level of violence used indicates a loss of emotional control during the actual murders, which we call disorganized elements. This combination of organized planning and disorganized execution is typical of perpetrators who have personal relationships with their victims. The decision to remove Tina Sharp from the scene is particularly significant. In my experience, this type of victim removal serves one of three purposes: elimination of a witness, satisfaction of additional psychological needs, or creation of ongoing psychological torture for surviving family members. The fact that Tina's remains were discovered 3 years later in an isolated location suggests the third motivation was primary. Before we continue with the investigation timeline, I want you to think about something. How many unsolved murder cases from your own area might have been solved with different investigative approaches? The techniques I'm describing in the Keddie case analysis are still being refined today, and they're being applied to cold cases across the country with remarkable success. If you find this kind of forensic psychology analysis fascinating, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because I regularly break down other cases using these same methodologies. Hit that like button if you're finding this analysis helpful, and let me know in the comments if there are other unsolved cases you'd like me to examine through this psychological lens. By 1984, the Keddie investigation had essentially stalled. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department had exhausted their leads, and the case was effectively relegated to cold case status. However, during this period, several key pieces of information emerged that should have reinvigorated the investigation, but were instead largely ignored or mishandled. In 1984, a group of bottle collectors discovered human remains in Camp 18, a remote location about 20 miles from Keddie. These remains were eventually identified as belonging to 12-year-old Tina Sharp. The condition of the remains and the location where they were found provide crucial insights into the killer's psychology and methods. The fact that Tina's remains were found in a location that required specific knowledge of the local terrain suggests the perpetrator was familiar with the area. More significantly, forensic analysis of the remains indicated that Tina had been held alive for a period of time after the murders at Cabin 28 before being killed. This extended captivity represents what we call trophy-taking behavior, typically seen in cases where the perpetrator derives psychological satisfaction from prolonging the victim's suffering. The forensic evidence from Tina's remains also revealed details that were never released to the public. Without going into graphic detail, out of respect for the family, I can tell you that the condition of the remains support my psychological profile of a perpetrator who was acting out complex sexual and power fantasies. This wasn't simply about eliminating witnesses. It was about psychological domination and control. During the mid-1980s, several witnesses came forward with information that should have provided significant leads in the case. A couple who lived near Cabin 28 reported seeing suspicious activity on the night of the murders, including unfamiliar vehicles and unusual sounds. However, these witness statements were inconsistent with each other and with the physical evidence, leading investigators to dismiss them rather than work to resolve the discrepancies. More troubling, several people reported being approached by individuals who claimed to have information about the murders but demanded payment for their testimony. While some of these individuals were likely opportunists trying to profit from the tragedy, others may have possessed genuine information that was lost because of the contaminated investigation environment. The psychological toll of the Keddie murders on the surviving family members cannot be overstated. Sheila Sharp, who discovered the bodies, struggled with severe post-traumatic stress disorder for years. Rick and Greg Sharp, the two youngest boys who survived the night, were placed in protective custody and eventually moved away from the area. The extended family members were subjected to ongoing harassment from conspiracy theorists and amateur investigators, adding additional trauma to an already devastating situation. From a psychological perspective, the impact of unsolved murders on surviving family members represents a unique form of trauma that I call ambiguous loss. Unlike families who can process their grief and move forward after the perpetrator is caught and prosecuted, families of unsolved murder victims remain in a state of suspended psychological resolution. They can't fully grieve because they don't have closure, and they can't move forward because the threat remains unresolved. The Keddie case exemplifies this psychological torture. For over 40 years, the Sharp family has lived with the knowledge that whoever killed their loved ones remains free. This ongoing trauma has been compounded by the numerous conspiracy theories, amateur investigations, and sensationalized media coverage that have emerged over the decades. In the 1990s, the case received renewed attention when the television show Unsolved Mysteries featured the Keddie murders. While this exposure brought national attention to the case, it also attracted what I call parasitic investigators, individuals with no professional training who insert themselves into ongoing investigations, often compromising evidence and harassing family members.
The amateur investigation phenomenon is particularly problematic in cases like Keddie because it creates a contaminated information environment. Legitimate leads become mixed with speculation and conspiracy theories, making it difficult for professional investigators to separate credible information from noise. This contamination effect has plagued the Keddie case for decades and represents one of the biggest obstacles to eventual resolution. However, the renewed attention also brought positive developments. In the late 1990s, advances in DNA analysis technology began offering new possibilities for cold case investigation. Biological evidence that had been collected at the Keddie crime scene but never properly analyzed could potentially yield DNA profiles that might identify the perpetrator. Unfortunately, when investigators attempted to locate this biological evidence in the early 2000s, much of it had been lost, destroyed, or contaminated beyond analysis. This loss of evidence represents one of the most tragic aspects of the Keddie case and illustrates why proper evidence preservation is crucial in all homicide investigations. The case took a dramatic turn in 2008 when Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood took office and made the Keddie murders a priority for his department. Sheriff Hagwood brought a fresh perspective to the investigation and implemented modern investigative techniques that had been unavailable to earlier investigators. Under Hagwood's leadership, the department began what we call a cold case reconstruction. This process involves reviewing all existing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and applying modern forensic techniques to previously analyzed materials. The reconstruction also involved bringing in outside experts, including FBI behavioral analysts and forensic specialists. One of the most significant developments during this reconstruction was the discovery of additional evidence that had been overlooked or misfiled in the original investigation. In 2009,
investigators found a hammer in a pond near Keddie that matched the description of one of the murder weapons. More importantly, they discovered audio recordings of suspect interviews that had been thought lost for decades. These audio recordings provided crucial insights into the investigation's early focus and revealed several promising leads that had never been properly pursued. The recordings also documented inconsistencies in suspects' statements that could be analyzed using modern interview analysis techniques. The psychological profile I developed for the Keddie killer has evolved as new evidence has emerged over the past 15 years. Based on my analysis of the crime scene, the victim selection, the method of operation, and the post-crime behavior, I believe the perpetrator possesses several key characteristics. First, the killer was someone who had intimate knowledge of the Sharp family's routines and relationships. The timing of the attack, when specific family members were present and others were absent, suggests careful planning based on inside information. This points to someone within the immediate social circle of the family. Second, the perpetrator demonstrated what we call mission-oriented behavior. The murders weren't committed for a material gain or sexual gratification alone, but to accomplish a specific psychological goal. The killer was sending a message, either to the victims themselves or to someone else who would understand the significance of the crime. Third, the level of violence used indicates what we call personal cause homicide. The overkill evident in the crime scene suggests the perpetrator had strong negative emotions toward at least one of the victims. This wasn't a dispassionate killing, it was an act of rage and hatred. Fourth, the decision to spare the two youngest children while killing others in the household suggests the perpetrator had specific psychological boundaries. This selective targeting indicates someone who could compartmentalize their violence, which is typical of perpetrators with antisocial personality disorders. Finally, the removal of Tina Sharp from the scene and her eventual murder in a remote location demonstrates what we call signature behavior. This aspect of the crime served no practical purpose, but fulfilled a specific psychological need for the perpetrator. It represents the most disturbing aspect of the killer's psychological profile. Based on these characteristics, I believe the Keddie murders were committed by someone who knew the Sharp family well, who had access to information about their living situation and relationships, and who was motivated by complex psychological factors, including revenge, power assertion, and sexual sadism. In 2013, the investigation received renewed momentum when Sheriff Hagwood announced that his department had developed persons of interest based on the reconstructed evidence. While the sheriff did not release names publicly, sources close to the investigation indicated that the focus had shifted to individuals who were known to the Sharp family and who had been present in the Keddie area during the time of the murders. This development represents what we call investigative convergence, where multiple lines of evidence begin pointing toward the same suspects. The convergence in the Keddie case has been building slowly over the past decade as investigators have applied modern analytical techniques to the original evidence. One of the most promising developments has been the application of familial DNA analysis to biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. This technique, which wasn't available during the original investigation, can potentially identify perpetrators through their genetic relationships to other individuals in DNA databases. The psychological impact of these investigative developments on the surviving family members has been profound. After decades of uncertainty, the possibility that the case might finally be solved has brought both hope and renewed trauma. For family members who have spent 40 years learning to live with unanswered questions, the prospect of finally learning the truth represents both a blessing and a curse. From my perspective as a criminal psychologist, the Keddie case represents several important lessons for modern homicide investigation. First, the importance of properly securing and preserving crime scenes cannot be overstated. The contamination of the Keddie crime scene in the first hours after discovery compromised the investigation for decades. Second, the case illustrates the danger of investigative tunnel vision. By focusing on stranger suspects, rather than examining the complex interpersonal relationships within the Keddie community, early investigators missed crucial leads that might have solved the case quickly. Third, The Keddie case demonstrates the importance of behavioral analysis in understanding complex crime scenes. The psychological profile I developed provides a framework for understanding not just what happened, but why it happened and who might have been responsible. As we near the end of our analysis, I want to ask you a personal question that gets to the heart of why cases like Keddie continue to fascinate us decades after they occur. Have you ever lived in a small community where everyone knows everyone else's business? Can you imagine how terrifying it would be to know that someone in your immediate social circle was capable of such brutal violence? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because this psychological aspect of small-town murders represents one of the most disturbing elements of cases like Keddie. The current status of the Keddie investigation remains active under Sheriff Hagwood's leadership. While no arrests have been made, the department continues to receive and investigate new leads, many of which have emerged as a result of renewed public attention to the case. In recent years, several documentaries and podcasts have featured the Keddie murders, each bringing new attention to specific aspects of the case. While some of this coverage has been helpful in generating new leads, other presentations have perpetuated conspiracy theories and misinformation that complicate the ongoing investigation.
The psychological profile I've shared with you today represents my professional analysis based on decades of experience with similar cases. But it's important to understand that profiles are investigative tools, not definitive solutions. The actual perpetrator may possess characteristics that differ from my analysis, and it's crucial that investigators remain open to all possibilities as new evidence emerges. What we can say with certainty is that the Keddie murders represent one of the most psychologically complex unsolved cases in American criminal history. The combination of extreme violence, careful planning, selective victim targeting, and signature behaviors creates a unique criminal profile that challenges conventional understanding of homicide motivation. The case also illustrates the long-term psychological impact of unsolved murders on both surviving family members and the broader community. For over 4 decades, the residents of Keddie and the surrounding area have lived with the knowledge that whoever committed these brutal murders has never been brought to justice. This ongoing uncertainty creates what we call community trauma, a form of collective psychological injury that can persist for generations. From a broader criminological perspective, the Keddie case represents the evolution of homicide investigation techniques over the past 40 years. The mistakes made in the original investigation were typical of small-town police work in the early 1980s, when resources were limited and training in complex homicide investigation was often inadequate. The modern reconstruction of the case under Sheriff Hagwood's leadership demonstrates how advances in forensic science, behavioral analysis, and investigative methodology can breathe new life into cold cases. The techniques being applied to the Keddie investigation today are being used successfully to solve similar cases across the country. The psychological legacy of the Keddie murders extends beyond the immediate tragedy to raise fundamental questions about the nature of evil and the psychology of violence. How does someone become capable of such brutal acts? What psychological factors contribute to the development of individuals who can commit such heinous crimes? These questions go to the heart of criminal psychology and continue to drive research in the field. As someone who has dedicated my career to understanding violent crime, I can tell you that cases like Keddie serve as crucial learning opportunities for law enforcement, forensic science, and criminal psychology. Every aspect of this case, from the initial crime scene processing to the ongoing investigation, provides lessons that can be applied to future cases. The Keddie murders also highlight the importance of community support for surviving family members of homicide victims. The Sharp family has endured decades of public scrutiny, conspiracy theories, and sensationalized media coverage while dealing with their own profound grief and trauma. Their resilience in the face of such ongoing challenges represents one of the most remarkable aspects of this tragic story.
if the Keddie case is eventually solved, it will likely be through a combination of modern forensic techniques, behavioral analysis, and the persistent investigative work being conducted by Sheriff Hagwood's team. The resolution of this case would not only bring closure to the Sharp family, but would also demonstrate the power of modern investigative techniques when applied to historical cases. However, even if the case remains unsolved, its impact on the field of criminal investigation has been profound. The lessons learned from the mistakes made in the original investigation have influenced training programs for law enforcement officers across the country. The case serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper crime scene management, evidence preservation, and systematic investigative approaches. The psychological analysis I've shared with you today represents just one perspective on this complex case. Other experts might emphasize different aspects of the evidence or develop alternative profiles of the perpetrator. This diversity of analytical approaches is actually beneficial to the investigation, as it ensures that all possibilities are considered and that no potential leads are overlooked. What remains clear is that the Keddie murders represent far more than just another unsolved case. They embody the intersection of small-town America, family dysfunction, investigative challenges, and the enduring impact of violence on communities. The case continues to generate interest not just because of its mysterious aspects, but because it touches on fundamental questions about safety, justice, and the nature of evil itself. As we conclude our analysis of the Keddie Cabin Murders, I want to emphasize that this case remains actively under investigation. While 4 decades have passed since that horrific night in April 1981, advances in forensic science and investigative techniques continue to offer hope for eventual resolution. The psychological profile and behavioral analysis I've presented today provide a framework for understanding this complex case, but they represent just part of the larger investigative puzzle. The dedicated work of Sheriff Hagwood and his team, combined with ongoing advances in DNA analysis and other forensic techniques, may yet bring justice for Sue Sharp, Johnny Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp. For the surviving family members, the passage of time has not diminished their need for answers and closure. Their courage in continuing to cooperate with investigators and their resilience in the face of decades of uncertainty serve as inspiration for all of us who work in the field of criminal justice. The Keddie case reminds us that behind every unsolved murder are real people whose lives have been forever changed by violence. While we analyze crime scenes and develop psychological profiles, we must never forget that our ultimate goal is to bring justice to victims and peace to their families. The story of the Keddie Cabin Murders is far from over. As long as this case remains unsolved, investigators will continue their work, applying new techniques and following new leads in pursuit of the truth. And perhaps someday, the question that has haunted the Sharp family and the community of Keddie for over 40 years will finally be answered. Who committed these brutal murders and why? Until that day comes, the Keddie Cabin Murders will remain one of America's most perplexing unsolved cases, a reminder of the complexity of human evil and the persistence of those who seek justice for the innocent victims of violent crime.